Good morning. So we've been studying what's unique about the Gospel of Matthew, and we've said that we can look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke and learn something about the uniqueness by a couple of different things. First of all, what is found in one gospel that's not in another? A whole story or teaching or miracle or something that's in one gospel and not another. What does it tell us about the goal of that gospel author that was included? What does it tell us about the goal of a different gospel author that it wasn't included? But also, when the same story appears in two different gospels, but it's told with different levels of detail and so on, what does that tell us? Now, one of the things that's unique about Matthew, and we can see what he includes that's not necessarily included in Mark and Luke, includes a lot of conflict between Jesus and the Jewish leaders. Now, we talked about how Matthew shows a lot of signs of being a gospel written to convince Jewish audience that Jesus was the Messiah, and that he would include things that would be helpful in that goal. And so one of them is, I would guess, doesn't he need to convince them, stop following the Jewish leaders and start following Jesus? So he's got to bring this conflict out in the open here. He's got more of this in his gospel. He's got more sharper contrast, sharper division, actual hostility between Jesus and the Jewish leaders is emphasized more in Matthew than any other gospel. One particular example is the woe to you, scribes and Pharisees chapter. Chapter 23 is a whole chapter of Jesus speaking these things. Now, we mentioned that Mark is a recording of the gospel preaching of Peter in Rome to a Gentile audience. And that's why Matthew and Mark make such a great contrast. Mark omits everything that's in chapter 23 because it's not really that important, is it? If you're a Gentile living in Rome and you don't know anything about Judaism, the Old Testament, Jewish leaders, what they've been teaching, that's not really important to you, is it? That Jesus had this conflict with them. The conflict comes out in Mark in several ways, but not as sharply or not as lengthy as it is for Matthew. Matthew's writing for Jews. And the Jews he's writing to need to make a choice. Stay in the synagogue. This is in the early, maybe 60 AD or something like that. Stay in the synagogue. Keep following the Jewish leaders. Reject Jesus as Messiah, or accept Jesus as Messiah. Stop following Jewish leaders. Probably be kicked out of the synagogue. It's a big thing to ask. In 60 AD, the Jews had gotten more and more hostile to Christianity by that time. There wasn't any difference of opinion allowed in the synagogues by this time. So when Matthew's trying to convince a Jew, accept Jesus as Messiah, he's trying to convince them to be ostracized, to be booted out of the fellowship of the synagogue. It's a big thing to ask, and so he has to spend a lot of time on it, convincing them Jesus is the one you want to follow, not the Jewish teachers that you're following. Now, this is a verse that's been abused over the centuries. During the arrest and trial of Jesus, Matthew records some in the crowd shouting out, since Pontius Pilate didn't really want to take responsibility, even though it was his responsibility. He's the only one who could punish Jesus. But they shouted out, "His blood be on us and our children." Now, this has been used in various waves of anti-Semitism over the centuries, in the Middle Ages, for example, in Europe. But can those men in that crowd in the first century truly place guilt on someone 1,000 years later by shouting this? I mean, that's not how guilt works. You know, as we're told many times in the Bible, you're guilty of your own sin, not someone else's. So the anti-Semitism never made any sense to me because I wanted Jesus to die, right? Jesus wanted to die. That was his mission, among other things. And I'm thankful that Jesus died on the cross. I'm not full of resentment towards those who crucified him, whether Roman or Jews, because what's the alternative? No crucifixion, no atonement for sin. That never made any sense to me theologically, that people would resent either Jews or Romans. And also, you know, once again, why resent the Jews and not the Romans, who were the ones who actually had the power to carry out the crucifixion? So it's a pretty weak pretext. It shows an underlying anti-Semitism, you know, that doesn't really make sense historically, but it especially doesn't make sense theologically. We are happy that Jesus died for our sins. We're grateful. And nobody who lives centuries later is responsible, be they Roman or Jewish, for it. But this does highlight the antagonism between the Jewish mob, in this case, which has some leaders, Jewish leaders in it. The antagonism between them and Jesus is highlighted in Matthew. Oops, got some bad animation there. The Sadducees. This is another one of those things where the Gospels kind of all start to blend together for us, and we don't realize the Sadducees are hardly mentioned outside of Matthew. That's one of the things we want to bring out in the study. There are 7 passages in which the Sadducees are referred to in Matthew. There's 1 each in Mark and Luke. 0 in John. And all 7 passages are negative. Right? We take a look at Matthew chapter 3, verse 7. That's the first mention of Sadducees. After Jesus had been baptized by John the Baptist, it says, when he, referring to Jesus, saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to the place of his baptism, he said to them, brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? Therefore produce fruit consistent with repentance. And don't presume to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father, for I tell you that God is able to raise up children from Abraham. Actually, this whole passage is John the Baptist talking. I can tell you that God is able to raise up children for Abraham from these stones. So the language is very, very harsh that's recorded here. Would that language really mean anything to a Roman that Peter's preaching to and Mark is recording? Sadducees were in charge of the temple in Jerusalem. They were very important among the Jews. They weren't important outside of Jerusalem, so certainly not in Rome. Isn't it odd, though, that conflict is so sharp in the so-called Jewish gospel, but as we already discussed, in order for Matthew to convince Jews to accept Jesus as Messiah, doesn't he have to face this conflict head on? I mean, the conflict is right there in their own synagogues in 60 AD. So you can hardly avoid it. You can hardly skirt around it. You've got to bring it out. And just as an aside, lots of times if you look in a study Bible, it'll say, some scholars think the Gospel of Matthew was written in about 60, 62 AD, and some think it was written in the 80s AD or something like that. Well, as part of the evidence that it was written early, there's not a whole lot of point after 70 AD of talking about Sadducees. So Matthew's not going to compose stories or even emphasize stories about Sadducees after the temple is destroyed in 70 AD, because the Sadducees, as we know from Jewish history, became completely irrelevant and basically dissolved as a group, because their only role was to run the temple. They were resented by other Jews because in order to maintain their authority in the temple, they cozied up to the Roman leaders. And you actually had Roman governors choosing who was going to be high priest and choosing, who were the leaders among the Sadducees. Then when 70 AD came and the Jewish rebellion led to the Romans destroying the temple, the Sadducees were basically no more. They just fade out of history instantly. And so there's really no point in Matthew writing in the 80s AD, for example, about Sadducees, or making this a point of emphasis in his gospel. So why do we get this? Some scholars say it was written in the 80s and some in the 60s. It's because in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I believe in John, there are prophecies by Jesus that Jerusalem and the temple will be destroyed. So what do skeptical scholars always resort to when they come across a prophecy that's fulfilled? They say, it must not have really been a prophecy. It must have happened, and then somebody, after the fact, wrote something up and made it look like a prophecy. There's really, I've investigated this a lot, there is no scholarly basis whatsoever for dating Matthew, Mark, and Luke after 70 AD. But there's an assumption. If you assume, if you're the kind of scholar who assumes that there really is no God and no prophecy and so on, well, then you have to assume it's written after 70. Otherwise, you have to admit that there was a futuristic prophecy that came true later. And that's the only basis. If you ever come across this nonsense about when were the Gospels written and how late were they written, that's the only basis for it. If you assume that there cannot be supernatural prophecy, then what do you have to do with the dating of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John? You have to date them all after 70 AD. And then in the ultimate circle logic, once they've dated them in the 80s and 90s, based entirely on their own anti-supernatural assumptions, they say, well, if they were written that late, then of course they weren't written probably by eyewitnesses. So they undermine the trustworthiness of the gospel by using the late date of their authorship and saying, these eyewitnesses would all most likely be dead by now. But where did they get the late date for the authorship? Out of their own anti-supernatural assumption. So it's just one big circle logic. When you actually investigate the Gospels, as I've taught before, you see all the signs of eyewitness testimony. The eyewitnesses recording little details that eyewitnesses tend to remember that aren't necessarily even all that important to the story. That's just the way people tell stories when they were actually there. So all of this conflict with the Sadducees would tend to indicate this gospel was written when the Sadducees were still relevant. And that means it was written at such a time that the temple still existed. And that means that Jesus' prophecies about the temple and Jerusalem being destroyed truly were futuristic prophecies. Now, the Sermon on the Mount, this is another interesting thing. We look at the Sermon on the Mount, and it seems like one of the most beautiful, one of our most favorite passages, right? Because it has all kinds of instruction from Jesus, and it has instruction of the kind that kind of goes against the grain. It calls us to something higher in life, doesn't it? We often miss the specific Jewish conflict nature of the Sermon on the Mount because we can apply it to our lives. Chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Matthew are the Sermon on the Mount. If we look at Matthew chapter 5, it starts out with the Beatitudes. And then we have a little section here, verses 17 through 20, that's kind of a prelude to the conflict that he's about to stir up between himself and the Jewish leaders. Matthew 5, 17 through 20. Don't assume that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For I assure you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all things are accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches people to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commandments will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And then he concludes with this sentence in verse 20. But I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So that's a little prelude. He's about to, in the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, quite a bit, enter into conflict with the scribes and the Pharisees, Jewish leaders. And he doesn't want it to be misinterpreted as go out and break the law. Don't pay attention to the old covenant anymore. He's not saying that. He has to set up, avoid that kind of misunderstanding, right? And so he warns them, no, I came to fulfill the law. But then he says, your righteousness will have to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. Now he moves on to correct the teachings that this crowd has heard from their leaders. And all throughout the rest of chapter 5, we keep having Jesus say, you have heard it taught, but I say to you. Now, in some cases, what he does is he affirms what they've heard, but then he goes beyond it. You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, whoever looks at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So he's not saying you were, in this particular example, he's not saying you were taught incorrectly by your teachers. He's saying, let's get at the spirit of the law. Let's go beyond just the letter of the law. But there are other examples where he is definitely correcting what they have heard. Matthew 5, verse 43. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Love your neighbor is the golden rule, Leviticus 19:18. So when he says, you have heard, love your neighbor, that's correct teaching. But he says, and you've heard, hate your enemy. Where's that in the Old Testament? It's nowhere. So if they've heard that, what's going on? Well, what happened with the parable of the Good Samaritan? Somebody stood up before Jesus, and in reference to being told, love your neighbor, he said, who is my neighbor? Because at the time, the Jews were trying to rationalize, my neighbor means my fellow Jews. I can't possibly be asked to love, for example, these Romans, who we don't even want in our land, these dirty Gentiles, you can't possibly think I should have to love them, right? And Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan and concluded it by saying to the man who had asked him the question, who is my neighbor? He said, well, who acted as a neighbor to the man who had been set upon by thieves? And he had to admit, well, it was the Samaritan. Because the Samaritans were another group. That's not my neighbor, right? You can't possibly ask me to love those stinking Samaritans. Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself, can't possibly require me to love Samaritans and Gentiles and so on, can it? So if they have heard love your neighbor and hate your enemy, they have been taught something that goes beyond the Old Testament, haven't they? They have probably been taught it's okay to love all your fellow Jews and not love anybody else. That's what that Old Testament passage really meant. When Leviticus 19:18 said, love your neighbor as yourself, see, the word neighbor doesn't mean everybody. And so when Jesus corrects them in verse 43, he is definitely correcting them. He's not just going into the spirit of the law or whatever. He is correcting them. In many of the other examples, he goes into the spirit of the law. Go the second mile. If someone asks you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. In other words, have a certain spirit as opposed to a grudging obedience to the command. And that's why he says, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. What he's accusing them of is a grudging obedience to the letter of the law. Not the spirit of the law, but just the letter. Just, okay, I have to do this. I don't want to, but I have to. And then we move into chapter 6 of the Sermon on the Mount, where he starts talking about the spirit of their leaders and about how they seek to be praised by men. It starts out with the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer, sometimes it's called the model prayer, but I think it's a model only in the sense of the attitude. He starts out criticizing the Pharisees for standing around on street corners and praying so that people will see them and think, oh, isn't he holy? Isn't he righteous? And he says, instead, go into your closet and pray. And pray like this. And then how does it start out? With humility. Humility and praise for God sets the tone for the Lord's Prayer as opposed to your own righteous. But whenever you pray, you must be not like the hypocrites, because they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by people. I assure you they've got their reward. But when you pray, go into your private room, shut your door, and pray to your Father who's in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Therefore, skipping down to the prayer, you should pray like this: Our Father in heaven, your name be honored as holy or hallowed. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And only after submitting to God, only after humbling yourself before God, do you go on to ask for something. And even then, how much do you ask for? Give us this day our daily bread. That's not much to ask for, is it? So even that request is humble. Even that request is an act of humility and submission before God. So he's modeling the spirit of prayer. There are things that are missing from the Lord's Prayer that are good things to have in prayer. There's no intercession for someone else in the Lord's Prayer, but Paul talks about that as being very important. Right? The Lord's Prayer isn't intended to be the prayer that you recite all the time today. It's intended to demonstrate the proper spirit of prayer. And he's contrasting it with who? Jewish leaders standing around, praying out loud in the synagogue, standing up, praying out loud on the street corners and so on, so that people will see them. You know, I'm reminded of an old Jewish comedian joke. He said, my father would stand up in the synagogue during fundraising and say, "I pledge $500 anonymously." And you know, you don't want to have that kind of motivation seeking the praise of men. Prayer is humbling yourself before God. That's what Jesus is emphasizing. But he's emphasizing it in contrast to the Jewish leaders. So Peter, I believe, recognizing the nature of the Sermon on the Mount, I don't believe he preached it in Rome, and that's why it's not in Mark. At first it might seem confusing. The Sermon on the Mount is so wonderful, how could Mark omit it? Right? We're not recognizing fully the Jewish nature of the Sermon on the Mount. The correction of Jewish leaders, the correction of their teachings, the correction of their attitudes. Peter recognized it as a Jew. And so I think he didn't preach that as part of the gospel message. It's useful to us today. After you become a Christian, it's extremely useful to get the spirit of the Sermon on the Mount and try to live by it. But if you're preaching the gospel to convert a Gentile in Rome, then I don't think that it really fits. And that's why it's not present in the Gospel of Mark. And it's present in Luke in pieces. And when we get to Luke, we'll talk about why that is. Another important thing in the Gospel of Matthew is Jesus' mission to the Gentiles. Now, this is going to seem a little odd too. Wait a minute, this is supposed to be the Jewish gospel, right? But Matthew is the only one who records these Gentile wise men, magi, visiting the baby Jesus. He's got a series of 3 parables that take up a chapter's worth of length, predicting the demise of the Jewish leadership. And only the middle one of the 3 is found in the other gospel. So that shows his emphasis. Now you can see the demise of the Jewish leadership being prophesied by Jesus. How would that be relevant in 60s AD in a gospel that's trying to convert Jews? Well, that should be obvious, right? He's trying to lure them away from their Jewish leaders. This is one of the ways to do it. To show that their leadership was destined and prophesied to come to an end. And we'll pick up there next week.